In our previous video, we looked at the active sprints view of an agile board, a Scrum board here in Jira. Now let's take a look at the backlog of the Scrum board. So if we click on this, let's just kind of get familiar with this interface here. So we still have our menu over here on the left-hand side that stays the same. I'm going to collapse this so we can see the right-hand side a little bit more. So up here at the top, we know that this is the backlog. We have our same quick filters, which can be set up by either our team leader, manager, or Jira administrator that we can use to filter all of our issues. So if I want to see just my issues, for example, I can do that. We have the same ability to actually minimize the header to be able to really focus in on our backlog area here. And then we have the backlog itself. So up here, we currently have a sprint going, so we can see the name of that sprint, how many issues are in that sprint, and then all of the issues that are currently in that sprint right now. We can also see the duration of the sprint, so it starts on February 23rd, ends on March 8th. You can see that. If we collapse that, we can see the actual backlog. So all of these issues are in the backlog, which essentially means that they're not having any work done to them yet, so they're not in the current sprint. Now, if we click on one of these, just like with the active view, we're going to see our details for this issue. So things like our status, components, a lot of this stuff, once again, can be customized by the Jira administrator. I'm going to close out of this here. Now, when we're working in Jira, really, ideally, you'd want to only work on things that are going on in your sprint, right? So ideally, you'd only be working on these 3 issues day to day. That's really what you focus on. But in the real world, a lot of times people come and want you to work on something mid-sprint. Now, that's where the backlog can be really helpful, not only in the actual sprint planning, but throughout your day-to-day work. Because if somebody comes to you and asks you to do something, you can say, is that something I need to work on right now? In which case, you go to your team leader, manager, and figure out what needs to come off of the sprint so you can put something else on, since we all agreed in the sprint meeting to actually work on these items. Or you can say, well, is that something I can just add to my backlog? And if that's the case, you can add it in here. So you can create a new issue right here very quickly, choose whatever the issue type is. So let's say this is a feature request. Somebody really wants the ability to upload new music to the site, something like that, right? So we can create that. You can see that this issue has been created. And if we wanted to make sure it doesn't get lost, we can actually send that to the top. So I'm going to hit the shortcut S and then T, and that's going to send to the top. Oops, don't want to actually be creating a new issue, so I'm going to cancel out of this. With this issue selected, if I hit S and then T, that will send it to the top of the current backlog. And very similarly, if we wanted to reorganize this and maybe send something to the bottom, say this searching for information, we can hit S and then B, and that will send it to the bottom. You can also just click and drag in order to rearrange these. Really where this is beneficial is when you get to your sprint planning, if you have all of the highest priority things that you think you need to work on in the next sprint at the very top, your sprints will go that much faster, because then you can come in and say, okay, here's my issues. These are the things that I think I need to work on. Maybe this top 2 here, those are at the very top. Great. We don't need to go sifting through. A lot of times the backlog can get to be hundreds or thousands of issues even for a person or for a team. And if you are able to sort those as you go, your sprints will go that much faster. And fortunately, Jira has the ability to be able to sort that with a simple drag and drop. All right, so the last thing I want to point out is you can add issues to a sprint in the middle of that sprint. So if we click and drag, we can add this into the sprint. However, Jira will try to let you know that the scope of your sprint will be affected. And this is going to affect any reports that will happen for this sprint. Because if you agree to do these three issues, and then you start adding more things in the middle of the sprint, your reports are going to be all messed up. The estimates for what you thought you could get done in that sprint are going to be all messed up. And so ideally, that's something that you will go to your team lead or your manager and really say, this is a higher priority. So-and-so asked me to do this. Is that okay if I take something else off, put this on? Or if you think you can get both done, that's great. But that's really just a discussion that needs to happen. And that's really where this drop or this box comes in, is just kind of making sure that you actually want to do that. You can confirm, and then that issue will be added into your sprint. Now, we haven't really talked much about versions and epics, and we're not really going to talk about what these are in this particular video, but I do want to point out that you have these here. So essentially, if you have multiple issues that are going to span a sprint, that would be an epic, and then the versions are just like think of it like a software version. That's exactly what it is, the ability to group together multiple issues into a version. And I know I said I wasn't really going to talk about what these are, but that's essentially what they are, and you can see those here in the backlog. It's really helpful to be able to see if there's, for example, maybe multiple UX things that are in the overall epic of getting the UX done for the site. You can kind of start to see the progress for those as you're actually working. We'll look at creating epics and actually creating versions and things like that in a different video, but you can access those here in the backlog as well. All right, so the only other thing we haven't really looked at are the reports, and typically these are things that team leaders or managers are going to pay more attention to, so that's going to be in a different module where we'll cover the reports. So let's move on to our next video and talk about a Kanban Agile board and kind of get the idea of what that looks like here in Jira.